The service dog knew something was wrong before Carlos Medina did. Ranger's ears went flat, and his body pressed closer against Carlos's leg under the booth, a warm weight of reassurance that had kept Carlos grounded for 3 years now. The German Shepherd mix had cost him nothing, a gift from a veterans organization in Phoenix, but had given him back something he'd thought he'd lost forever, the ability to sit in a public place without watching every door. The Dusty Rose Diner sat on the main drag of Saguaro Junction, Arizona, a small town that survived on highway traffic and stubbornness. Carlos had been coming here every Saturday for 6 months, ever since he'd started his night janitor job at the elementary school and discovered he needed a place to be on the mornings he couldn't sleep. The waitresses knew his order: black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, no conversation, and they knew to let Ranger settle under the table without comment. Today, though, something was different. There was a new manager behind the counter, a nervous-looking man in a polo shirt who kept glancing at Carlos's booth like he was calculating a risk assessment. Carlos tried to ignore it. He pulled out the photograph he kept in his wallet. Lucia, 8 years old in the picture, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a crayon drawing of a house with a yellow sun. She was 10 now. He'd missed 2 birthdays. His ex-wife, Sandra, sent pictures sometimes, but she'd stopped responding to his requests for visits. He didn't blame her. He'd been hard to live with in the years after his second deployment, and by the time he'd gotten help, she'd already made her choice. The new manager approached the table. His name tag read Kevin, and he was gripping a menu like a weapon. "Sir, I'm going to need you to take the dog outside." Carlos looked up slowly. He'd learned not to make sudden movements, not to let his body language read as aggressive. The VA therapist had taught him that, how to make himself small, how to signal that he wasn't a threat. "He's a service animal," Carlos said, keeping his voice even. "I have documentation. We've had complaints." Kevin's eyes darted to a booth across the room, where a family with 2 young children was seated. The mother was watching with an expression Carlos recognized, fear masked as concern. "Other customers are uncomfortable. He's trained. He won't bother anyone." "I'm sorry, sir, but our policy, the ADA requires you to accommodate service animals." Carlos reached for his wallet, where he kept the laminated card with Ranger's certification. "I can show you—" "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words landed like a punch, not because they were surprising. Carlos had been asked to leave places before, had learned to recognize the look that preceded it, the calculation that decided he was more trouble than he was worth. But because he'd thought this place was different, he'd thought he'd found somewhere safe. Ranger pressed harder against his leg, sensing the shift in his heartbeat, the cortisol spike that preceded the bad moments. Carlos closed his eyes and breathed the way the therapist had taught him. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out. "Okay," he said. He stood up, left a $10 bill on the table for the coffee he hadn't finished, and walked toward the door. He didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He'd learned a long time ago that making scenes only made things worse, that the world had decided what he was worth, and fighting that decision just exhausted him faster. He didn't see the women watching from the corner booth. There were 7 of them, ranging in age from mid-30s to early 60s, occupying the large round table near the kitchen. They wore leather cuts over civilian clothes, some in jeans, some in business casual, and the patches on their backs read Desert Mothers MC, with a silhouette of a woman on a motorcycle against a setting sun. They'd been having their monthly breakfast meeting when Carlos walked in, and they'd watched him settle into his booth with the practiced vigilance of people who knew how to read a room. Maria Santos, judge to the club, though she'd been retired from the Army JAG Corps for 8 years now, set down her coffee cup as Carlos pushed through the front door. "Did that just happen?" asked the woman beside her, a younger rider named Dominguez, who still had the coiled energy of recent separation from active duty. "It just happened." Maria's voice was calm, but her eyes had gone cold. "Get the name off his credit card receipt if you can, and somebody find out who the franchise owner is for this place." "What are we doing?" Maria stood and pulled on her jacket. "We're going to go talk to that man, and then we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to him again." Outside, the Arizona sun was already brutal, despite the early hour, heat rising from the asphalt in visible waves. Carlos stood next to his truck, a 15-year-old Tacoma with a dented fender and a faded Marine Corps sticker on the back window, trying to convince his hands to stop shaking. Ranger sat at his feet, watching him with liquid brown eyes that saw everything and judged nothing. "We're okay, buddy," Carlos said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the dog or himself. "We're okay." He heard the door open behind him and turned to see the women filing out of the diner. 7 of them, moving with purpose, and for a moment, Carlos felt the old instinct flare, assess the threat, calculate exit routes, prepare to fight or flee. But they weren't approaching with aggression, they were approaching with something worse: kindness. The oldest one, silver hair, sharp eyes, the bearing of someone who'd spent decades being the most competent person in the room, stopped a respectful distance away. "I'm Maria Santos," she said. "I saw what happened in there. I'm sorry that man treated you that way." Carlos didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to witnesses. He wasn't used to anyone seeing the small indignities that had become the texture of his life and deciding they mattered. "It's fine," he said. "It happens." "It shouldn't." Maria's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent a career arguing cases. "Service animals are protected under federal law. What he did was illegal." "I know. But you left anyway." Carlos looked at her, at the patches on her cut. Army veteran, JAG Corps, president of whatever the Desert Mothers were, and felt something twist in his chest. "Fighting takes energy," he said. "I don't have a lot to spare." Maria nodded slowly, like she understood the shape of what he wasn't saying. "Can I ask your name?" Carlos Medina." "Marine Corps?" He was surprised. "How'd you know?" "The way you stand, the way you de-escalated in there instead of engaging." She almost smiled. "I spent 20 years reading soldiers. You learn to recognize your own." Carlos reached down to touch Ranger's head, grounding himself. "What do you want?" "I want to help, if you'll let me." Maria pulled a card from her pocket and held it out. "We're a veterans advocacy group, among other things. That man in there violated your rights, and if you're willing, we can make sure he doesn't do it to anyone else." Carlos looked at the card. Desert Mothers MC, Veterans Riding for Veterans, Maria Santos, President. A phone number, an address for a VFW post in Mesa. "I don't want to cause trouble," he said. "You didn't cause anything. That manager did." Maria's eyes were steady. "But I understand if you're not ready. It's a lot to ask, going public with something like this. It means telling your story. It means standing up when it's easier to walk away." Carlos thought about Lucia, about the photograph in his wallet, the gap-toothed grin, the yellow sun. He thought about the man he'd been before Afghanistan, the man who'd believed he could protect the people he loved just by being strong enough to fight. He'd stopped believing that a long time ago. "I'll think about it," he said. Maria nodded. "That's all I'm asking." She stepped back, giving him space. "But Carlos, what happened in there? It's not your fault, and it's not something you should have to accept." She walked back toward the diner, the other women falling in behind her. Carlos watched them go, the card still in his hand, the sun beating down on his shoulders. Ranger whined softly and pressed his nose against Carlos's palm. "I know, buddy," Carlos said. "I know." He got in his truck and drove home to the one-bedroom apartment that still felt too big without Sandra and Lucia in it. He put the card on the kitchen counter next to the stack of unopened mail and the photograph of his daughter he'd framed but couldn't hang because looking at it hurt too much. He sat on the couch with Ranger at his feet and stared at the wall until the shaking stopped. Somewhere across town, 7 women were making phone calls, and in a diner on the main drag of Saguaro Junction, a manager named Kevin was beginning to realize that the quiet man he'd asked to leave hadn't been as alone as he'd looked. Kevin Marsh sat in the back office of the Dusty Rose Diner, staring at his phone and trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so fast. 3 weeks. He'd been manager for 3 weeks, promoted from assistant manager at the Tucson location after the previous manager quit without notice. His district supervisor had made it clear. The Saguaro Junction location was underperforming, customer complaints were up, and if Kevin couldn't turn things around by the end of the quarter, there wouldn't be a 4th quarter to worry about. So when the mother at table 6 had flagged him down, her voice pitched high with concern. "There's a dog in here. My daughter has allergies. Can't you do something?" Kevin had done something. He'd walked over to the man in the booth by the window and asked him to leave, because that's what managers did. They solved problems. They made customers happy. He hadn't known about service animal laws. He hadn't known that the laminated card the man had tried to show him was federally recognized documentation. He hadn't known that the woman at table 6 was lying about the allergies because she'd seen the man's face, brown-skinned, scarred, haunted, and made assumptions that had nothing to do with dogs. He knew now. The 7 women from the corner booth had made sure of that. They'd returned to the diner after the man left, and the oldest one, silver-haired, sharp as a blade, had stood at the counter and explained, in precise legal terms, exactly what Kevin had done wrong. She'd cited statute numbers. She'd mentioned the Department of Justice. She'd asked for the franchise owner's contact information in a voice that suggested she already knew it and was giving Kevin a chance to cooperate. He'd given her everything she asked for. What else could he do? Now his phone was buzzing with a text from his district supervisor. "Call me ASAP. We have a situation." Kevin closed his eyes and thought about his wife, 8 months pregnant with their first child. About the apartment they'd just signed a lease on, the one with the nursery they'd spent 3 weekends painting pale yellow. About the health insurance that came with this job, the health insurance they couldn't afford to lose. He'd made a mistake, a stupid, ignorant mistake, and now he was going to pay for it. His phone buzzed again. He answered. "Kevin." His supervisor's voice was tight. "What the hell happened this morning?" Across town, Maria Santos sat in her home office, surrounded by the organized chaos of a woman who'd spent her career building cases out of chaos. Legal pads covered the desk, each one filled with her sharp handwriting. A laptop displayed the corporate structure of Dusty Rose Diners, LLC. On the wall behind her hung her JAG Corps commendation and a photograph of her daughter, Elena, in her navy dress whites. Elena had been dead for 4 years now. Suicide, 3 months after returning from her second deployment. She'd never told Maria about the assault, never reported it, never asked for help. Maria had found the letter after, the one Elena had written and never sent, detailing everything that had happened and everything she'd been too ashamed to say out loud. That letter had ended Maria's career in military law. It had started her career in everything else. She picked up the phone and dialed Carlos Medina's number. It rang 4 times before he answered. "Mr. Medina, this is Maria Santos from this morning." A pause. "I remember." "I wanted to let you know what we found. The franchise owner for that diner is a man named Richard Castellan. He owns 14 Dusty Rose locations across southern Arizona. And this isn't the first complaint his restaurants have received about service animal discrimination." Silence on the other end. "There have been 3 other incidents in the past 2 years," Maria continued. 2 of them involved veterans. None of them went anywhere because the victims didn't want to pursue it. She let that sit for a moment. "You could change that." "How?" "By letting us file a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, by going on record about what happened, by being willing to tell your story." Another pause, longer this time. When Carlos spoke, his voice was flat. What would that accomplish? It would establish a pattern of behavior. It would force the franchise to implement training, change their policies, maybe pay damages. It would make sure the next veteran who walks in there with a service dog doesn't get treated the way you were treated. And what would it cost me? Maria understood the question. It wasn't about money. It was about exposure. The vulnerability of being seen, of having your wounds examined by strangers, of becoming a symbol when all you wanted was to be left alone. It would mean interviews, depositions possibly. Your name would be public. Your service record would come up. People would know what you've been through. She paused. "I won't lie to you, Carlos. It's not easy. But you wouldn't be doing it alone. I need to think about it. Take the time you need. But Carlos..." She hesitated, then pressed forward. "Whatever happened to you over there, whatever you're carrying, it doesn't disqualify you from standing up. It qualifies you." The line went quiet, and for a moment, Maria thought he'd hung up. Then, "I'll call you tomorrow. That's all I'm asking." Carlos ended the call and sat on the edge of his bed, Ranger pressed against his leg, the phone heavy in his hand. He thought about the last time he'd stood up for something. 3 years ago, a month after he'd come home from his second deployment. Sandra had found him in the garage at 3 a.m., holding his service weapon, staring at it like it held answers to questions he couldn't ask. She'd taken the gun from his hands and held him while he sobbed, and the next morning she'd driven him to the VA and sat with him for 6 hours while he waited to see someone. That was the last time he'd let himself need anyone. 2 months later, she'd filed for divorce. She'd said it wasn't about him, wasn't about the PTSD or the nightmares or the way he flinched when cars backfired. She'd said she just couldn't watch him disappear into himself anymore, couldn't keep reaching for someone who kept pulling away. He hadn't fought it. He hadn't fought anything since. His phone buzzed. A text from Sandra. Lucia's school play is next Friday. 7 p.m., she's playing a sunflower. She asked if you could come. Carlos stared at the message, his throat tight. Lucia had asked. Not Sandra. Lucia. His daughter, who'd been 6 years old when he'd deployed the second time, and 8 when he'd finally come home to a house that didn't feel like his anymore. She'd asked if he could come. He typed back, "I'll be there." Then he looked at Maria's card, still sitting on the kitchen counter where he'd left it. He thought about the diner, about Kevin's nervous eyes, and the way the other customers had looked at him like he was a threat. Oh, he thought about all the times he'd walked away from fights because fighting took energy he didn't have, because losing hurt worse than not trying. But Lucia had asked, and maybe, if he couldn't fight for himself, he could remember how to fight for the person who might still believe he was worth something. He picked up the phone and dialed Maria's number. "I'll do it," he said when she answered. "Whatever you need, I'll do it." Tuesday afternoon, Maria convened an emergency meeting at the VFW post in Mesa. The Desert Mothers were there in force, 12 riders now, word having spread through their network, along with a civil rights attorney named David Ochoa, who'd driven down from Phoenix, and a reporter from the Arizona Republic named Tanya Whitfield, who'd been covering veterans' issues for 15 years. Carlos sat at the end of the table, Ranger at his feet, feeling like a specimen under glass. "The franchise owner is already in damage control mode," David said, spreading documents across the table. "His lawyer called me this morning, asking what it would take to make this go away quietly. They're offering a settlement, $10,000, a written apology, mandatory service animal training for all staff." "That's something," one of the writers said. "It's not enough." Maria's voice was flat. "Settlements keep things quiet. They let corporations write checks instead of changing behavior. We've seen this pattern before. The same franchise has paid out twice in the past 2 years. They treat it as a cost of doing business." "So what's the alternative?" Carlos asked. David looked at him. "We go public. We file the DOJ complaint, but we also let Tanya run the story. National attention, social media pressure, the full weight of Publix. Accountability." He paused. "It's riskier. The settlement disappears. The franchise fights back. Your name becomes part of the story in a way you can't control. But it might actually change something," Maria added. "Not just for you. For every veteran who's been told their service dog isn't welcome, their PTSD isn't real, their sacrifice doesn't entitle them to basic dignity." Carlos looked at Ranger, who was watching him with those steady, understanding eyes. The dog had seen him at his worst. The panic attacks, the nightmares, the days when getting out of bed felt like climbing Everest. Ranger had never judged, never walked away. "My daughter has a school play on Friday," Carlos said quietly. "She's playing a sunflower. She asked me to come." The room was silent. "I haven't been to one of her school things in 2 years. Her mother stopped inviting me because I kept canceling, kept finding reasons not to show up. I told myself I was protecting her, that she was better off without a father who couldn't keep his hands from shaking in crowded rooms." He looked up at the faces around the table. "But she asked. She still asked." Maria leaned forward. "What are you saying, Carlos?" "I'm saying I'm tired of walking away." He touched Ranger's head, drawing strength from the contact. "I'm saying that if I can't show up for myself, maybe I can show up for the next guy, the next veteran who walks into a diner with his service dog and gets told he's not welcome." He straightened in his chair. "Run the story. File the complaint, whatever it takes." Tanya Whitfield smiled and pulled out her recorder. "Then let's get started. Tell me everything, from the moment you walked into that diner." Carlos took a breath. And then, for the first time in 3 years, he told his story to someone who was listening. Tanya's article went live on Wednesday morning. By noon, it had been shared 40,000 times. Marine veteran with service dog asked to leave Arizona diner. Franchise has pattern of discrimination. The headline was everywhere. Local news, national outlets, the endless churn of social media. Carlos's phone rang constantly until he turned it off. Maria fielded interview requests from CNN, Fox News, and a producer from a morning show who wanted him to fly to New York. He declined them all. "I told my story," he said when Maria pressed him. "I don't need to tell it 100 times." By Thursday, the franchise was in crisis mode. Richard Castellan, the owner, released a statement expressing deep regret and announcing that Kevin Marsh had been terminated. He promised a full review of service animal policies across all 14 locations. He called it an isolated incident and a failure of training. Maria read the statement aloud at an emergency meeting that afternoon, her voice dripping with contempt. Isolated incident. 3 prior complaints, and it's an isolated incident. "At least he fired the manager," Dominguez said. "He threw Kevin Marsh under the bus to protect himself." Maria set down her phone. Castellan knew about the previous complaints. He chose not to act, and now a 28-year-old manager with a pregnant wife is out of a job while the man who created this culture walks away clean. Carlos had been staring at his hands, but he looked up at that. "Kevin has a pregnant wife?" 8 months. Maria's expression softened slightly. "I'm not saying what he did was right, but he was set up to fail by a system that didn't train him, didn't support him, and is now using him as a scapegoat." Something twisted in Carlos's chest. He'd been so focused on his own humiliation that he hadn't thought about Kevin as anything other than the man who'd asked him to leave. But Kevin was someone's husband, someone's soon-to-be father, someone who'd made a mistake and was about to lose everything for it. "Can we do anything for him?" Maria raised an eyebrow. "You want to help the man who kicked you out?" "I want to help the man who got used as a shield." Carlos rubbed Ranger's ears, grounding himself. "There's a difference." Before Maria could respond, David Ochoa burst through the door, his face pale. "We have a problem." He dropped a folder on the table. Inside were printouts, legal documents, what looked like medical records, a photograph of Carlos in his dress blues that he didn't remember anyone taking. "Castellan's lawyers have been busy," David said. "They're not just playing defense anymore, they're going on offense." Maria picked up the top document and scanned it, her expression hardening with each line. "They subpoenaed his VA records?" "They're claiming Carlos has a history of aggressive behavior and psychological instability. They're going to argue that Kevin had legitimate safety concerns, that asking him to leave was a reasonable response to a perceived threat." The room went cold. Carlos felt the words land like shrapnel, tearing through the armor he'd spent 3 years building. "That's not," his voice cracked. "I've never hurt anyone. Ranger is trained to keep me calm. He's the reason I can—" "I know." David held up a hand. "I know. But they don't need to prove it's true. They just need to plant doubt. Make the story about your mental health instead of their discrimination. Turn the victim into the villain." Maria was still reading. "They've contacted his ex-wife. They're asking her to testify about his erratic behavior during their marriage." Carlos couldn't breathe. Sandra. They were going to drag Sandra into this, make her relive the worst years of their marriage, force her to choose between protecting him and protecting herself. And Lucia. God, Lucia. If this went to trial, if his medical records became public, if his daughter heard what the lawyers would say about him. "I can't," he said, pushing back from the table. "I can't do this to them. Carlos, no." He stood, his hands shaking, Ranger pressing anxiously against his leg. "The settlement, I'll take. The settlement. Whatever they want. I'll sign a non-disclosure. I'll say it was a misunderstanding. I don't care. Just—" His voice broke. "I can't let them use my daughter against me." The room was silent. The Desert Mothers exchanged glances. David closed the folder slowly. Maria rose from her chair and walked around the table to stand in front of Carlos. She didn't touch him. She understood about touching, but she stood close enough that he could see the lines around her eyes, the weight she carried. "My daughter was a Navy corpsman," she said quietly. 2 deployments. Came home with wounds nobody could see. She paused. "She killed herself 3 years ago. Left me a letter explaining why she never told me what happened to her overseas." Carlos went still. She was assaulted by a superior officer. She didn't report it because she knew what would happen. The investigation, the questions, the way they'd dig through her life looking for reasons to blame her. Maria's voice was steady, but her eyes were wet. She stayed silent to protect herself, and the silence ate her alive. She reached into her cut and pulled out a photograph, a young woman in navy whites, smiling at the camera with Maria's eyes. Her name was Elena. And every day, I wonder what would have happened if she'd found people willing to stand with her, if she'd known she didn't have to carry it alone. Carlos looked at the photograph, at the face of a woman who'd served her country and been destroyed by the silence that was supposed to protect her. They want you to be afraid, Maria said. They want you to believe that hiding is safer than fighting, but I've seen what hiding costs. I buried it. She put the photograph away. You're not Elena. You have people standing with you, and whatever they throw at us, we'll throw it back. She met his eyes, but only if you're willing to stay in the fight. Carlos thought about Lucia, about the school play tomorrow, the sunflower costume, the hope in her voice when Sandra had said she asked if you could come. He thought about what kind of father he wanted to be, the one who ran from hard things, or the one who showed his daughter that standing up mattered even when it hurt. Sandra, he said slowly, they're going to contact her. Probably already have. Then I need to call her first. He pulled out his phone. She shouldn't hear about this from a lawyer. She should hear it from me. He walked outside, Ranger at his heels, and stood in the parking lot while the Arizona sun beat down. He dialed Sandra's number and waited. Carlos? She sounded wary. Is everything okay? No, not really. He took a breath. I need to tell you something. About what's been happening this week, about what might happen next, and I need to ask you something I should have asked a long time ago. He told her everything. The diner, the discrimination, the article, the legal threats. He told her about the settlement he'd almost taken and the reasons he'd decided not to. He told her about Maria's daughter and the cost of silence. And then he asked, I know I have no right. I know I've let you and Lucia down more times than I can count, but if they contact you, if they ask you to testify, he closed his eyes. Tell them the truth. Whatever that is, don't protect me. Just tell them the truth. The line was quiet for a long moment. The truth, Sandra said slowly, is that you were the bravest man I ever knew. The truth is that what happened to you overseas wasn't your fault. The truth is that I left because I was scared, not because I stopped loving you. Carlos couldn't speak. The truth is that our daughter asks about you every day, and when I tell her you're coming to her play tomorrow, she's going to be the happiest kid in that school. Sandra's voice softened. You want me to tell them the truth? I'll tell them you're a good man who got hurt doing something most people don't have the courage to do, and if they have a problem with that, they can take it up with me. Sandra, I'll see you tomorrow, Carlos. Don't be late. She hung up. Carlos stood in the parking lot, the phone pressed against his chest, tears streaming down his face. Ranger whined and pressed his nose against Carlos's palm. Yeah, buddy, Carlos whispered. We're okay. We're going to be okay. He walked back inside. Maria and the others looked up as he entered. Sandra's with us, he said. Whatever they throw at us, she's with us. Maria smiled, a real smile, the first one he'd seen from her. Then let's get to work. Friday's the school play. Saturday, we make our move. Dominguez leaned forward. What happens Saturday? Richard Castellan is hosting a grand opening for his newest location. Big press event, ribbon cutting, the whole show. Maria's smile turned sharp. We're going to give him an audience he didn't expect. The Desert Mothers began making calls, and in a small apartment across town, Carlos Medina opened his closet and looked at the suit he hadn't worn since his wedding day. Tomorrow, he would watch his daughter be a sunflower. Saturday, he would show her what standing up looked like. The elementary school auditorium smelled like floor polish and nervous energy, and Carlos Medina sat in the third row with his hands clasped in his lap, trying to remember how to breathe. He'd almost turned around in the parking lot, almost convinced himself that Lucia would be better off without him there, that he'd just be a distraction, that the crowded room full of strangers would trigger something he couldn't control. But Ranger had pressed against his leg, steady and warm, and Carlos had remembered what Maria said about silence. He'd spent 3 years being silent. Tonight, he was showing up. Sandra had saved him a seat. She looked up when he slid into the chair beside her, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness, exactly, but the beginning of something that might grow into it. You came, she said. I said, I would. You've said that before. I know. He met her eyes. I'm trying to be different now. The lights dimmed before she could respond. The curtain rose on a garden scene, construction paper flowers bobbing on wooden sticks, and 20 third graders filed onto stage in costumes their parents had sewn and hot glued into existence. Lucia was in the second row, her face painted yellow and brown, her costume a riot of felt petals. She scanned the audience with anxious eyes, and when she found Carlos, her whole face transformed. She waved, a tiny, excited wave that broke something open in Carlos's chest. He waved back. The play was terrible in the way all elementary school plays were terrible. Missed cues, forgotten lines, one kid who picked his nose through the entire second act. But Lucia delivered her 3 lines with fierce concentration, and when she sang her solo verse about growing toward the sun, her voice was clear and true and completely unafraid. Carlos watched his daughter be a sunflower, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than the weight he carried. He felt hope. Afterward, in the chaos of the reception, Lucia found him near the punch bowl and threw herself into his arms with the complete abandon of a child who hadn't yet learned to protect herself from disappointment. "You came!" She was crying, laughing, her felt petals crushed between them. "Daddy, you came." "I wouldn't miss it, Mija." He held her tight, breathing in the smell of her hair, the fabric paint on her costume, the reality of her. "You were amazing." "I was so scared, but then I saw you and I wasn't scared anymore." Carlos pulled back and looked at his daughter. 10 years old, gap-toothed grin replaced by a smile that was half woman now, but still his Lucia, still the girl in the photograph he carried everywhere. "Being scared is okay," he said. "The brave part is doing it anyway." She hugged him again, and over her shoulder, Carlos saw Sandra watching. She was crying too, and smiling. Maybe some things could still be fixed. Saturday morning, the parking lot of the new Dusty Rose Diner location in Chandler was a circus. Television crews, print reporters, a crowd of onlookers drawn by the promise of free food and local celebrity. Richard Castellan stood at the center of it all, silver-haired and silver-tongued, working the room like a man who'd never had to answer for anything in his life. The motorcycles arrived at 10:47 a.m. 32 bikes, rolling in formation down the main road, engines thundering in unison. The Desert Mothers led the convoy, followed by riders from 3 other veterans clubs who'd heard about the story and decided to make the drive. They filled the parking lot in neat rows, killed their engines in sequence, and dismounted in silence. The television cameras swung toward them. The crowd parted. Castellan's smile flickered. Maria walked to the front of the formation, her silver hair bright in the Arizona sun. Behind her came Carlos, ranger at his side, wearing a clean shirt and the dog tags he'd kept in his drawer for 3 years. "Mr. Castellan," Maria's voice carried across the parking lot without a microphone. "My name is Maria Santos. I'm president of the Desert Mothers MC and a retired Army JAG officer. I believe you've heard about us." Castellan's composure held, but barely. "This is private property. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We're on the public sidewalk. We have every right to be here." Maria pulled a folder from her jacket. "We're also here to present you with something." She handed the folder to Castellan, who opened it with the expression of a man defusing a bomb. "That's a formal complaint to the Department of Justice, documenting a pattern of service animal discrimination across your franchise locations. It includes testimony from 4 veterans, including Carlos Medina, whom your manager illegally ejected from your Saguaro Junction location last Saturday." Castellan's jaw tightened. "My lawyers have already—" "Your lawyers tried to smear a Marine Corps veteran by subpoenaing his psychiatric records and contacting his ex-wife." Maria's voice went cold. "That strategy tends to play poorly in the court of public opinion, especially when the veteran in question has 32 witnesses willing to testify about the man he actually is." The cameras were rolling. Reporters were scribbling. Castellan looked from Maria to the wall of motorcycles to the growing crowd of spectators, and Carlos could see the calculation happening, the weighing of options, the search for an exit. "I also have something else for you," Maria said. She pulled out a second document. "This is a proposed consent decree. If you sign it, you agree to implement comprehensive service animal training across all locations, establish a veterans liaison position at the corporate level, and make a $50,000 donation to the Wounded Warrior Project." "And if I don't sign?" "Then we pursue the DOJ complaint. We cooperate fully with any resulting investigation, and we make sure every media outlet in the country knows exactly how you treat the men and women who served this nation." Maria's eyes were steady. "Your choice, Mr. Castellan." Castellan stared at the document. The cameras kept rolling. The silence stretched, and then a voice came from the back of the crowd. "I'll sign it." Everyone turned. Kevin Marsh pushed through the onlookers, his face pale but determined. He was wearing a polo shirt with no name tag, no corporate logo, just a young man in civilian clothes, carrying a folder of his own. "I was the manager at Saguaro Junction," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm the one who asked Mr. Medina to leave, and I'm the one Mr. Castellan fired to cover his own failure to train his staff." He walked to where Castellan stood and held up his folder. "After I was terminated, I started making calls to other managers, other employees, other locations. I found out I wasn't the only one who'd been put in that position, told to handle service animal complaints without any training, any guidance, any support. I found out Mr. Castellan knew about the pattern of discrimination and chose to do nothing because settlements were cheaper than systemic change." He turned to face the cameras. "I made a mistake. I hurt someone who deserved better, and I'm willing to testify to everything I know about how this company operates, who knew what, and when they knew it." Castellan's face had gone gray. He looked at Kevin, at Maria, at the crowd of witnesses and cameras documenting his unraveling. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "No, sir." Kevin met his eyes. "You made the mistake. I'm just refusing to be the only one who pays for it." Carlos stepped forward. He hadn't planned to speak, but something moved him. The memory of his own silence, the cost of carrying weight alone. "Kevin." He waited until the younger man looked at him. "What you did to me was wrong. You know that." Kevin's face crumpled slightly. "I know. I'm sorry. Let me finish." Carlos held up a hand. "What you did was wrong, but what you're doing now, standing up, telling the truth, refusing to let someone else hide behind your mistake, that takes courage. The kind of courage I didn't have for a long time." He extended his hand. "I'm not going to sue you. I'm not going to ask for your job, but I am going to ask you to do something." Kevin stared at the hand. "What?" "Take the service animal training. Learn what you should have been taught from the start, and then make sure nobody who works for you ever has to make the choice you made." Kevin took his hand and shook it. His grip was trembling, but his eyes were clear. "I will. I promise." Maria turned back to Castellan. "The consent decree, Mr. Castellan, or would you like to continue this conversation in front of the DOJ?" Castellan looked at the document, at the cameras, at the army of veterans who'd shown up for a man they'd never met. And Carlos watched the fight go out of him, not with a bang, but with the slow deflation of a man who'd finally run out of room to hide. "I'll sign," he said quietly. Maria handed him a pen. He signed. The cameras flashed, and then Dominguez started clapping. The other riders joined in, then the crowd, then the reporters. The sound built and built until it echoed off the building and filled the parking lot with something that felt, for a moment, like justice. Carlos stood in the middle of it with Ranger at his side, feeling the sun on his face and the weight of his dog tags against his chest. Maria found him in the crowd. "How do you feel?" He thought about Lucia's arms around his neck, about Sandra's eyes in the auditorium, about Kevin Marsh's trembling handshake and the courage it took to stand up when everyone expected you to stay down. "Like maybe it's okay to stop hiding," he said. Maria smiled. "Yeah, that's how it starts." The convoy rode out of Chandler an hour later, 32 bikes in formation, chrome catching the Arizona sun. Carlos rode in Maria's sidecar, Ranger's head resting on his lap, watching the desert scroll by in shades of gold and rust. They'd won. Not completely. There would be hearings, investigations, the slow grind of accountability. Castellan's lawyers would probably fight the consent decree. Kevin Marsh would have to find a new job, but something had shifted, something that couldn't be unshifted. And tomorrow, Carlos would call Sandra and ask if he could take Lucia to breakfast, just the two of them, at a diner where the staff knew how to treat a veteran and his service dog. He was done being invisible. He was done walking away. It was time to start showing up. 6 months later, summer had turned the Arizona desert into an oven. and Carlos Medina sat in a booth by the window at the Dusty Rose Diner in Saguaro Junction. Same booth, same window, same view of the parking lot where he'd stood shaking 6 months ago, trying to convince himself he was okay. But everything else had changed. Ranger lay beneath the table, calm and settled, his head resting on Carlos's foot. The waitress who'd brought his coffee, black, same as always, had smiled when she saw the service dog and said nothing, except, "Beautiful Shepherd, what's his name?" The new manager, a woman named Patricia, who'd been through the corporate training program twice, had stopped by to check that everything was satisfactory. It was satisfactory. It was more than satisfactory. It was the simple dignity of being treated like a human being, and Carlos still wasn't used to how good that felt. The bell above the door chimed, and Lucia burst through, Sandra trailing behind with the patient exhaustion of a mother who'd learned to keep up. "Daddy!" Lucia slid into the booth across from him, her face flushed from the heat, her smile wide enough to light the room. "We went to the aquarium, and I touched a stingray, and it was so slimy. And Mom said you probably wouldn't want to hear about slimy things at breakfast, but I said you would, because you told me about the time you found a scorpion in your boot." "Breathe, mija." Carlos laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and surprised him every time. "We've got time." Sandra slid into the booth beside Lucia, her eyes meeting Carlos's across the table. They weren't back together, might never be, and that was okay. But they were something now. Co-parents who could sit in the same room without the weight of old wounds pressing down on them. Friends, maybe, or something close to it. "She's been talking about this all week," Sandra said. "Saturday breakfast with Dad. You'd think I was taking her to Disneyland." "Better than Disneyland." Lucia grabbed a menu, even though she always ordered the same thing, pancakes with extra whipped cream, a side of bacon she'd share with Ranger when she thought no one was looking. Disneyland doesn't have Ranger. Carlos reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand. She squeezed back, and the contact grounded him the way Ranger's weight grounded him, the way showing up every week for 6 months had grounded him. He'd kept his promise. Every Saturday, breakfast with Lucia. Every other Wednesday, dinner at Sandra's house where he helped with homework and pretended not to notice when Lucia fell asleep on his shoulder during movies. Every Thursday, the VA support group where he'd finally started talking instead of just listening. It wasn't perfect. He still had bad days, days when the world felt too loud and the walls felt too close, and Ranger had to work overtime to keep him present. He still woke up some nights with sand in his throat and gunfire in his ears. He still carried the weight of what he'd seen and done and failed to prevent, but he carried other things now too. Lucia's gap-toothed grin finally updated in his wallet to the 10-year-old smile she wore now. Sandra's voice on the phone, checking in because she wanted to, not because she had to. Maria's steady presence at the monthly Desert Mothers rides, where veterans who'd never met showed up for each other, because that's what you did. The DOJ investigation had concluded in April. Castellan's franchise had been fined, his consent decree made permanent, and his corporate board had quietly suggested he pursue other opportunities. The last Carlos had heard, he was selling real estate in Scottsdale and pretending the diner business had never happened. Kevin Marsh had landed on his feet. Maria had made some calls, pulled some strings, and found him a position at a veterans employment nonprofit in Phoenix. He'd completed his service animal training twice by choice, and now ran workshops for other businesses on disability accommodation. He still sent Carlos a text every few months, just to check in, just to say thank you. Carlos always texted back. Some debts didn't need to be repaid. They just needed to be acknowledged. The photograph of Elena Santos still hung in Maria's office at the VFW post, next to a new photograph, a group shot of the Desert Mothers at the Chandler confrontation, 32 riders standing in formation, Carlos and Ranger at the center. Maria had framed them side by side, the daughter she'd lost and the cause she'd found. "She would have liked you," Maria had told Carlos once late at night after a meeting when everyone else had gone home. "Elena, she would have understood what you're carrying, and she would have been proud of what you did with it." Carlos hadn't known what to say. He still didn't, but he'd hung his own photograph on the wall of his apartment, the one Tanya Whitfield's photographer had taken at the grand opening, Carlos and Kevin shaking hands while the cameras flashed. He looked at it every morning when he woke up and every night before he went to sleep. It reminded him that he'd stood up, that he'd stayed, that showing up mattered, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. The waitress returned with Lucia's pancakes and Sandra's omelet and more coffee for Carlos. Ranger's tail thumped against the floor as Lucia snuck him a piece of bacon under the table, and Sandra rolled her eyes but didn't say anything, and Carlos felt something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for years. He wasn't fixed. He might never be fixed, but he was here, present, accounted for, taking up space in the world instead of trying to disappear from it. Lucia looked up from her pancakes, whipped cream on her nose, and caught him watching her. "What?" she asked. "Nothing." Carlos smiled. "Just glad to be here." She grinned and went back to her pancakes, and Sandra's hand found his under the table and squeezed once before letting go, and Ranger sighed contentedly at his feet. Outside, the Arizona sun beat down on the parking lot where everything had changed. Inside, a veteran sat in a booth by the window, with his daughter and his dog, and the beginnings of a life he'd stopped believing he deserved. Some battles you won by standing up, some you won by staying. Carlos Medina had finally learned the difference. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of courage in unexpected places. And tell us in the comments, when did standing up change everything?